Hello. So in today's lesson, we are looking at what new laws were introduced from 1500 to 1700. We're still in that second of our 4 time periods when looking at crime and punishment. We've got 2 learning objectives: to understand why new laws were introduced from 1500 to 1700 and to understand the impact these laws had on England. So there are 2 quizzes to complete, and these are in your Google Classrooms. Please complete the correct quiz when prompted. Please read the questions carefully. You only get 1 attempt. Any questions you might have, feel free to contact me, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. So in the previous lesson, we looked at how religion brought about tension and new laws in England from 1500 to 1700. And we looked at the confusion of heresy and treason and the monarchs who were in charge, and the fact that you had the Catholic and the Protestant faith at the time. Now, in today's lesson, we are going to look at other laws that were introduced from 1500 to 1700, which were not really a result of religion, but other circumstances. So the first thing we're going to look at is vagabondage. So what is a vagabond or a vagrant? Well, around 1500, there was a change in the population. Now, before, most people didn't leave the area they were born in. You're born in a village, you live in the village, you work in the village, and you die in the village. You never leave the area. You never need to. The problem was that we're now starting to see growing populations. People are living a bit longer, and the population is rising in England at this time. Wages, as a result, are being reduced because of the increased population. There's more people to do the work. Food prices are going up because you need to feed more mouths at the time. So all of these circumstances mean that people had to leave their village sometimes if they were looking for work to survive. If there's no job in your village, you either stay there and die, or you leave and you look for work elsewhere. So these unemployed, homeless people were known as vagabonds or vagrants, people who had left the place they were born to look for work. So why were these a problem? Well, when a vagabond would arrive at a new village or town, they would struggle to find work. And the reason for that is because these problems were all across England at the time. Issues of the population rising, a lack of food for people, a lack of jobs. And so these people would arrive in a new area and they would have nowhere to live. They wouldn't know anybody. There's no money for food. And so that means to survive, people had to turn to crime often. Now, this was a problem if you lived in this town and you were well off, because now you were starting to see vagrants turn up in your town, and these were seen as potential criminals. People saw all the vagrants/vagabonds as potential criminals as a result, because they were all capable of crime if they didn't find a job. And people often had the view that these vagabonds were lazy and they were beggars, rather than working hard for a job. The idea is they just didn't want to work hard. They would rather just beg for money instead. And they also thought they've brought these issues on themselves. Incidentally as well, the printing press had started to become more common in England at this time. And this means that pamphlets, when we say pamphlets we mean leaflets, could be made in larger numbers as a result and handed out to people to share information. It really was sort of the Twitter of its time, I guess. Now, one leaflet was made at this time warning people about the dangers of vagabonds. It showed no sympathy to them at all. You can see it pictured here. And it was giving information to people, saying no beggar was in genuine need of help. So this is what the population was told. And the leaflet warned about different groups of beggars. And they were all given different names. Some of these are excellent potential band names. These included the Dummers. They were people pretending to be deaf and mute. The Drunken Tinkers, and these were thieves who pretended they were local traders. The Priggers of Prancers, these were horse thieves. And the Kinchin Morts, basically female girl beggars. And these pamphlets show a show of fear and mistrust of the vagabonds in England. It didn't matter who the vagabond was, if they were elderly, if they were young, if they were male, if they were female. There was little sympathy. People didn't want vagabonds in their area. They felt vagabonds meant crime. So laws had to be brought in to try to remove them from towns. We're going to look at these now. The first one we see is the Vagrancy Act of 1547. And this law is brought in and it's incredibly harsh. And it basically says an able-bodied vagabond who was without work for more than 3 days was to be branded with the letter V and then sold as a slave for 2 years. Now, that was incredibly harsh, and the idea was that actually, if they bring this law in, then people won't hang about in towns. And the problem was, this law was a bit too harsh. People didn't feel comfortable doing this. They don't want the vagabonds in towns, but this is too extreme, they believe. So the punishment wasn't always carried out as a result. And we see this law being withdrawn after just 3 years, showing it wasn't working. So the next law brought in tried to deal with this, the Act for Relief of the Poor, 1597. And this new law introduced harsh punishments to vagrants to deter them from staying in towns. They want them gone. And it's not quite as harsh as before, but it's still pretty horrific. And they basically said, if you catch a vagrant in a town, someone who's begging, someone who hasn't got a job there, then they could be whipped, or they could have their ear burnt with a hot iron instead to mark them out. And the third law that was brought in for this time period, the final law, tried to make it more consistent. Some areas were dealing with vagabonds very harshly. Other areas were not dealing with them so well. And they said, look, all local parishes, when we say parish is basically a small area with its own church and priest. Lots of parishes all across the country. And they said, you are now expected to support people who were not physically fit for work. Like the elderly, like the disabled, people who just could not work. You couldn't give them a job. They were too old or they couldn't move properly. And these people were termed as the deserving poor. And they were given poor relief, which was basically financial assistance or money. So similar to benefits today, I guess. This meant these people didn't need to beg. This meant these people had some money. They were given money. They didn't need to work. They were given money to survive. The deserving poor, people who could not work. However, those who were fit enough to work but didn't have a job were labelled as the undeserving poor. And instead of support to help these people survive whilst they looked for work, they were seen as lazy. And again, these people could be branded, they could be whipped, or they could be sent to a new type of prison called a house of correction, where they would have to work hard. And that's looking at vagabonds or vagrants. So, task 1, can you please complete quiz 1 in Google Classrooms? Pause the video here to do so. If you need to go back over any information, the pink slides will be useful to you. Press play to continue. So apart from the vagabonds, what else was a problem? Well, another issue was the countryside and who controlled the lands. We're looking now at rural crimes. When we say rural, of course, we mean countryside. So during this time, there was new ideas about farming taking place and how to manage the lands in the countryside. And these new ideas had a huge impact on the poor people in the rural areas in the countryside. Now, there used to be large areas of land that the poor could access for free, and it meant they could hunt animals to survive, they could gather firewood to keep themselves warm, for example, they could get wild food like berries as well. It meant that the poor had an opportunity to survive by using this land. The problem was this land became enclosed by powerful landlords. Now, when we say enclosed, it was basically turned into private land. Hedgerows were put up, fences were put up, and it meant only the landowner could now use it. It was seen as private property. People were buying land and enclosing it so that they could take advantage of farming methods, such as sheep farming, which was proving more popular. Wool was being a valuable asset to farmers at the time. And so there was a lot of money to be made, but you don't want your sheep to go escaping across the fields, so fences were put up, land was made private. The poor people no longer had as much access to the countryside. Now, this means enclosure is a huge problem for people living in villages in the countryside. It means that they had to now leave the village to go to the towns to survive. We've already looked and seen at how that was a problem. Their source of food had gone. They had to buy food now, and they didn't have money to do this. They were poor. So as a result, many poor people were driven to trespassing and would enter the private land even though it was against the law. They would continue to hunt wild animals, sometimes known as game, to survive. Now, this was illegal hunting, and this is known as poaching. They would get on someone else's land and hunting. To stop this, a new law was introduced. The 1671 Game Act made these actions illegal. By 1688, if you were caught trespassing on someone's land poaching, you would be killed. They did not want people to trespass. They wanted to make this punishment as strong as possible and make this law as strong as possible to deter others. Again, the aim was to have harsh laws, so people never considered trespassing. They never considered poaching. But there were different views on this law, depending on your class in England at the time. So if you were in the upper class, if you were very rich, then you would see poachers as trespassers, as troublemakers, as criminals, and it's quite right they should be killed if they were caught breaking the law. Whereas the lower classes, the poorer people, felt sympathy for those who were poaching. They realised that actually these people were not doing it because they wanted to, but because they were forced into doing it to survive. So we see sympathy for this law, with people breaking this law. And this is an example of a social crime that we've looked at before. It's very similar to William's forest laws that we saw in the previous section. Now, many people felt this law was unfair, and so they didn't care if this law was enforced or not. They didn't care if this law was being broken. And again, we see that as a social crime. So the people's attitudes made it difficult to enforce this law because neighbours were not going to report on poachers to the authorities because it wasn't seen as a serious crime. And in some areas, this law made criminal activity increase. Now, this was because poachers realised they had to work together to break the law by forming poaching gangs. So you could have people on lookout, for example, to make sure that they weren't going to get caught, and if it looked like someone's going to catch them, you could make animal noises as a warning. Now, by working together, it meant more people were taking part in this crime, and it made it harder for the authorities to catch them. And one final one we're going to look at today is that of smuggling. So in the 17th century, the government realised that Britain was bringing in more goods from other countries than ever. They were importing more goods into the country, and the government sought a way of making money with a new tax. A new law was brought in called import duties. When we say import duties, these are taxes payable on goods imported or brought into the country. So, for example, things were being brought in like alcohol and tea, and that meant every time boat came to the docks, it was checked what was on there, and note was made, and people had to pay money to bring it into the country. This means that if you were bringing goods in from abroad to sell, you had to raise your prices higher to cover your costs from the import duties. But some people realised they could avoid the import duty for their items. And the way to do that was to unload their boats not at the docks like we saw in the previous picture, but instead somewhere where they couldn't be seen, where no one could check what had been brought in. For example, a cove or a beach at night time. The government wouldn't know that boat had arrived, and so it couldn't enforce the import duty on them. This is an illegal way of bringing goods into a country, and this is known as smuggling. And smuggling is another example of a social crime at the time, because people could buy goods far more cheaply from smugglers. They didn't have to pay the income tax when they came into the country. And so their prices were much lower as a result. People could buy goods like wine and tea at a far lower rate. And so this law was very difficult to enforce. So many people benefited from this crime, they didn't see smuggling as serious, that they were not prepared to tell the authorities if they knew about smuggling taking place. In fact, you had villages who would all work together to help the smugglers unload the boats, for example. So, task 2. Please now complete quiz 2 in Google Classrooms. The yellow and blue slides will help. Please pause the video here and then press play to conclude this lesson. And that is it for today, guys. Hopefully you've completed both quizzes and you've read the feedback there. As always, any questions, contact me, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. And all that remains for me to say is please look after yourselves, get some fresh air and exercise where you can, and I will see you soon. All the best and take care. Bye bye.